Yes, thank you, Magdalena, for this introduction of myself. And I'm just going to start. Science fiction has always been rich in imagery, not only rich in imagery, but also almost always featuring illustrations. There were book illustrations for books long before the first science fiction novel. Well known are the frontispieces and title plates that became common at the end of the Middle Ages and had their peak in the Baroque period. Frontispieces are wood engravings or copperplate engravings that are printed opposite the title page and usually mirror or add to the contents of a book in a somewhat coded way. Frontispieces are also elaborate and expensive, which is why they disappeared in the 19th century. I want to show in my talk that frontispieces, however, have survived in science fiction. But they also have changed, moving at times from the beginning to the middle of books and finally ending up screamingly colorful on the cover. This history of book illustrations is too long for a conference talk, of course. However, I know that Helion is a persistent club that doesn't give up on a topic right away once it becomes more extensive. So I'll take the liberty of just starting today and deferring further developments to later conferences to which I hope to be invited again. I have quite a bit to say about the illustrations of Jules Verne, Herbert George Wells and later authors. Today, however, I confine myself to a single novel and its frontispiece. Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, first published in 1818, is considered by many to be the first science fiction novel. Of course, the novel is also a precursor of later horror stories and is clearly in the tradition of the Gothic novel. After all, the novel was written in a situation that called for horror. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, later named Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, wrote it in 1816, when she was still a minor and had eloped with Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was married to someone else at the time, which is why she was socially ostracized. She later married him, but when she began writing, her social situation was dishonorable. On top of that, she had just lost a child and feared that her second child would die as well, which actually happened. Even before the novel was published, 3 of her children died. The mood of William Godwin's and Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter was between life and death. The immediate trigger to write Frankenstein was a summer vacation of Mary and her half-sister Claire Clairmont, their lovers Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, and the physician John Polidori. It was a dark summer, as the Indonesian volcano Tambora had erupted, causing cold and severe weather worldwide. The 5 summer visitors mostly stayed at the rented Villa Diodati on Lake Geneva. They believed that John Milton had once lived there and felt inspired to experiment with writing, although this belief was actually wrong. They encouraged each other to write ghost stories. 2 of them were eventually published: Polidori's The Vampire, a story that would later inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Mary's Frankenstein. The idea for the creepy novel, however, stemmed from the development of science. Ever since the Royal Humane Society, founded in 1774, had begun to teach and successfully practice the resuscitation of apparently drowned people, there had been uncertainty in English society about the exact boundary between life and death, and in which direction this boundary could be crossed. Physicians sought to explore intermediate stages, coma, fainting, sleep, as well as to scientifically explore the nature of life as such. This was known to the Shelleys, but they were particularly interested in Luigi Galvani's electrical experiments with frogs' legs, and in the experiments of Galvani's nephew Giovanni Aldini, who in 1803 electrocuted the corpse of the hanged criminal George Forster, who then opened one eye, raised one hand and clenched it into a fist, and moved his legs. This was also discussed in the Byron Shelley Circle at Lake Geneva. This becomes the central motive in Frankenstein and is also visible on the frontispiece. The creepy thing about the creation of the monster is precisely nothing supernatural, such as a vampire, a living mummy, or the Lazarus from the Gospel of John, but the scientific nature of the enterprise, which takes the sacred out of life and produces terrible consequences. Dr. Victor Frankenstein is a modern Prometheus, that's the novel's subtitle, who wrests the ability to create from the gods and then must assume the tormenting responsibility for the misfortune his creation brings. The book was first published in 1818 in a non-illustrated 3-volume edition by the London publishers Leckington, Hughes, Harding, Maver and Johns. Oh, many publishers. However, I will not consider the first edition, but the later 1-volume edition published in 1831 by the publishers Henry Colburn and Richard Bentley. In doing so, I'm sidestepping the expert dispute over which edition is the correct Frankenstein, since there are significant changes in the text. My concern is with the illustrations, and they are found only in the 1831 edition. Colburn and Bentley published a whole series called Standard Novels, each containing a title vignette and a frontispiece. On several occasions, the English painter Theodor von Holst was hired for this, and his designs were then engraved in copper and printed in the books. Typical for this are dark interiors with round or pointed arches, strong contrasts between light and shadow, and the emotional expressions of the protagonists that are emphasized as a result. This can be seen, for example, in Holst's frontispieces for Anna Maria Porter's historical romance The Hungarian Brothers, engraved by Charles Rolls, and for Friedrich Schiller's unfinished, but nevertheless most successful during his lifetime Gothic novel The Ghost Seer, engraved by William Chevalier. The most famous cover of the Standard Novels, and probably of Holst as well, however, is the one for Shelley's Frankenstein. Theodor von Holst was born in London on September 3rd, 1810, and was therefore only 8 years old when Frankenstein first appeared. He was fascinated early on by eerie and fantastic stories from Germany, such as the fairy tales of E.T.A. Hoffmann. Very early his talent was recognized, encouraged and exploited. At the age of 10, Theodor was already able to sell his first sketch to the president of the Royal Academy, Sir Thomas Lawrence, who subsequently gave him several commissions from King George IV for erotic drawings. Yeah, 10 years old at this moment. At the age of 13, he began his studies with Henry Fuseli at the Royal Academy. From him he learned not only the strong brushstroke and the composition of various elements in a painting, but also a preference for somber subjects. There was no text that Holst used as a literary source for his art as often as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust. Holst is its first English illustrator and sometimes gave the protagonist Dr. Faust his own face. Holst was also the first illustrator of Frankenstein and created both the frontispiece and the title vignette. This is fitting, not only because of his often rather offbeat choice of subject, which actually did not correspond to the taste of the time, but also because at the time of his work on the frontispiece he was, at 20, similarly young to Mary Shelley when the book first appeared. Holst's designs were engraved in copper by William Chevalier, and I would have loved to show you a picture of William Chevalier. I found many images engraved by Chevalier, but none that depict him himself. The title vignette shows an old-fashioned dressed Victor Frankenstein sadly turning away from his future wife Elizabeth to leave for studies in Ingolstadt. While Frankenstein is kept very dark except for his color and covers his face with his hand, Elizabeth shines with bright clothes, skin and hair. She symbolizes the good times and the home that Frankenstein is leaving behind, and she also symbolizes Christianity. She wears a cross around her neck, which Frankenstein is also leaving behind. Both figures take a step down a front door staircase, which is probably meant to indicate that they are both going downhill from here on out. The title vignette has the text quote, "The day of my departure at length arrived." The title and author of the novel are printed above it, with the usual publisher's information below. Overall, the impression is quite romantic and also quite conventional. Quite different is the frontispiece, which is on the left side opposite the title page. It shows the perhaps most famous Frankenstein scene, which nevertheless does not look at all like the countless visualizations in the well-known films. Here, too, the text passage is given. By the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. I rushed out of the room. We are used to seeing the monster as a ghastly-looking creature visibly assembled from mismatched parts. To the viewer of the frontispiece, the monster doesn't look monstrous at first. If it reminds me of a fantastic movie character, it's more like Arnold Schwarzenegger as Conan the Barbarian than Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster. It's well proportioned, muscular, has nice hair and good teeth. The Dr. Frankenstein of the novel had taken pains to put together a quite handsome creature. But his eyes, facial skin, and lips look horrible to him at the moment of awakening. This horror can also be seen on Frankenstein's face. Thus, Holst reproduces exactly what Shelley described. I cite, But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room." End quote. But the creature's face also looks frightened rather than terrified. It cannot yet process the function of his various senses and finds the light in particular unpleasantly blinding. After Frankenstein had moved away, his creature will also soon flee from the light of the rising sun into a forest. On the frontispiece, it is open to interpretation which light sources are responsible for the play of light and shadow. Outside the room, behind the LED lights, the moon still shines faintly. The room itself, however, must be illuminated from within. It almost seems as if a liquid is glowing behind the monster, casting the shadows of the galvanic apparatus under the alchemical symbols on the wall to the left. It seems to flow brightly from a retort in front of it. This light is joined by the bright rays that seem to illuminate the monster from the books on the shelf. The book light and the retort light stand for the metaphorical light of enlightenment, which is fed by theories and experiments and thus makes progress possible, the product of which is the monster. Frankenstein himself uses the light metaphor in the eureka moment of his research. I start the citation. "I paused, examining and analyzing the minutiae of causation as exemplified in the change from life to death and death to life, until from the midst of this darkness a sudden light broke in upon me, a light so brilliant and wondrous, yet so simple that I became dizzy with the immensity of the prospect which it illustrated." End quote. But in Frankenstein's laboratory, there is not only the metaphorical torch of enlightenment with all its promises and dangers, but also a profane candle whose light illuminates the monster from diagonally in front, that is, from the head of the reader who is just opening the book and looking into the peep show scene. The candle itself is not shown, but is specifically mentioned by Shelley. The double light on the frontispiece may be a symbol of form as well as content. Formally, it stands for the different narrative perspectives of Frankenstein and his creature, as well as, rather unimportantly, the captain who, like the moon, stands outside the action. In terms of content, it stands for the ambiguity of scientific progress. The reader's light, if I may call it so, illuminates not only the monster, but also an open book and a skeleton under rumpled shroud. The book and retort light is reflected in the round flask and Frankenstein's face, but makes other skulls and the top books on the shelf disappear into the penumbra. The blackest darkness is found behind the door, through which Frankenstein flees. Indeed, it could be argued that Frankenstein's misfortune begins by simply abandoning his creature to itself. It is precisely the abandonment that makes the creature a monster. It is an existential abandonment that no longer knows any consolation, and in this it differs from Elizabeth's temporary and therefore bearable abandonment in the title vignette. I will not say much about the novel, since I assume that it is known to you all. I will only briefly mention that it is an epistolary novel with 3 narrative levels corresponding to the 3 different light sources of the frontispiece. The top level of the narrative, symbolized by the moonlight, consists of Captain Robert Walton's letters to his sister Margaret Seville. Walton is an explorer who tries to reach the North Pole but fails. At least he meets Frankenstein and his creature on the way. The second story level, symbolized by the light of chemical experiment and theory books, is the story of Dr. Victor Frankenstein, who is also an explorer and as such creates the creature. This may be ingenious, but otherwise he is a fool who lets his revulsion at the sight of the awakened creature get the better of him and does not treat the creature like the cold-blooded scientist he appears to be. He could have vivisected the creature, or at least, as promised later, created a female creature for it as a mate. That would have stopped most of the mischief that happens in the novel. In this respect, the warnings about the hubris of science that are thematized in the first two levels of the novel are not entirely accurate. It is precisely Frankenstein's irrational fear and disgust that lead to the murderous despair of the lonely abandoned creature. Its account of its experiences since its creation are the third level of the narrative, symbolized by the candlelight that must be assumed at the position of the reader. The creature is curious and wants to know too, but it also wants to belong to society which it is not allowed to, mainly because of its appearance. The third level of the story contains a lot of social criticism, which I can't go into now. But here you learn to understand the monster and can understand why it starts to murder Victor Frankenstein's family. In all three narrative levels, Mary Shelley repeatedly works with light metaphors to illuminate the creature's motives, to shine a critical light on the social order, and especially to illuminate the dangers of science. One is sometimes reminded of a motive on a frontispiece for another book, Rousseau's First Discourse from 1750. There one sees the torch of enlightenment used by a man with Promethean zeal, but this torch can not only illuminate the darkness, one can also get burned by it. And Dr. Frankenstein is just such a modern Prometheus. Does he bring light, or does he burn himself? In the novel he does both, but I would argue that the evaluation of the Enlightenment and science in the novel is not so clear. It is left up to the reader. And that's quite typical of science fiction as it developed over the next 200 years. So, I have talked enough for today. Maybe next year I will deal with the further development of science fiction illustrations. In Jules Verne, the frontispiece is supplemented by numerous pictures in the book. After that, it becomes common for a while to have pictures only inside. Finally, the colorful covers of the pulp magazines appear, followed by the present-day covers of the paperbacks. But this I will show you next year and the years after that. Thank you so much.